In last week's episode, we talked about makers and the open sourcing of all or most of the things. Let's see what you had to say. Zhegames on the Idea Channel subreddit linked to a couple other threads across Reddit where people were having discussions about this episode. So if you want to see what other people in other communities had to say about this, these are some good links. These discussions were pretty good. Loco Dantes also on the subreddit started a really interesting conversation about the relationship the open sourcing of things has to do with safety. And it turns out that there are, both pros and cons as far as safety is concerned when you are open sourcing things. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the conversation that happened here was also ace, really good. Cretin Cobra 2 provides a pros and cons list for pervasive open sourcing, and I just wanted to point this out because I think that we are about to hit most, if not all, of these pros and cons. So if you don't want to watch the rest of this comment response video, you could basically just read this comment. So, nailed it, I guess. roidroid and a bunch of other people pointed out open source ecology, which maintains, amongst many other things, an open source trailer project. So this is something that is rad and totally worth checking out if you're interested in learning more about open source ecology. Ashley Knapp writes a really great comment about the frustration in not being authorized to fix the things that you own, and that, some people will just go ahead and repair those things even if they are not actually licensed to, but then ends on this really good short idea, which is, I think, important to point out, which is just because something is open source doesn't necessarily mean that it is morally good or desirable, that it is just a fact of its construction and availability. And I think that this is something that's really important to just make clear, that that open source does not necessarily equate across the board awesomeness, I guess. It just indicates open sourceness. David Snow and KaosNoKamisama raise really interesting points about the nature of ownership as it relates to the sort of objects and technology in our lives. That if you do pay an amount of money to own something, doesn't that mean that you should be able to kind of rip it open and maintain or repair it? Should you sort of own all parts of it, as opposed to in the situations like the tractor or your car or your computer, your cell phone, license it in some way? Should you just have access to all of it? And I think this is a really interesting and really complicated thing, because what is it that you own? Do you own this physical instance of this thing, which then has instances of other things baked into it? Or do you own the whole totality of its operation? And I think that like KaosNoKamisama sort of outlines, that there's a part of the hacker ethos that says that you should have it all, that you should not only have it all, but have access to it all. And I think I tend to lean in that direction as well, but like I said, man, it's a complicated set of things. Basil Parrott writes about crochet as a kind of microcosm of what's possible within communities when open source is the norm, and how the kind of open source parts of crocheting on the internet are vibrant communities that are invested in collaboration and sharing, and how exciting that is. And this really makes me wonder about, the history of crochet, because I think of it as something that is almost inherently open source, but that might just be because of my association I have with it, with craft, and craft being a thing that is about communities and people coming together and sharing their knowledge and sharing their resources for the things that they are making. But that, I could absolutely see how crocheting would eventually become maybe a mass craft or a mass art in some way. And now with the internet, people are able to find crocheting communities to then get back to what I would think as the sort of original, maybe old school crocheting paradigm. But I don't know, I'm gonna go, there's some Googling I have to do. I find myself suddenly interested in crochet. Switchlurk and Ethan Parcell write really awesome comments about how things like poetry, literature, or philosophy kind of already are open source to a certain degree, especially when you consider the fact that there are, in some sense, base level thoughts or ideas that reference concrete justifications or sources, source material, or bibliographies, or the fact that there are creative endeavors that indicate how they were put together, or how their constraints were considered. You can see that these things are in some way open source. And I think that the idea that I was trying to get at is that there is some kind of pure experience that is inherent to philosophy and poetry that would make it difficult to open source in that way, that the basis of those things is in some way purely either aesthetic or intellectual. But the more I think about it, the more I kind of disagree with my own statement, because that then would claim that things like programming or manufacturing are not in some way or at some base level aesthetic or intellectual, and they absolutely positively are. So I've come around on this point. Madeline Koller, Evan Johnsen, and Simon Dahinten all write really great comments about one of the big dangers if everything were to be open source, which is the lack of standards and how that would potentially affect usability. That if everything is open source, you have high customizability and you have high incidence of individuality in the technologies or implementations of those technologies, but then what suffers is a widespread understanding of how those things operate, how those things work, how they interact with other technologies. And a big example that I think you always see for this is Android. That, it is highly customizable, but for a lot of people is infinitely confusing. And so by keeping things closed in some sense, you are able to protect standards. And I wonder whether or not this is really there really is a one-to-one relationship here, that if it would be possible to have pervasive open source technology but still maintain some kind of standard where you don't have this weird individuality or customizability creep. And I don't know, I'm not so embedded in the technology world to be able to say confidently that that is a thing that's easy to do, but I would be curious to know what all of you think. Xuul and Ed Kauffmann raise really important concerns about what happens when you open source dangerous stuff, like when you open source encryption, it's already open sourced, or when you open source weapons or firearms, which to a certain degree you could also argue are already open sourced. And one of the responses to this that I saw that I really liked was that there's a certain comfort maybe, or there's a certain defense or protection inherent in the enemy knowing the system, that if you know exactly how things are built and that information is widely available, then you know to a certain degree what people who want to misuse or break that thing will do and will be able to do with those things. And so whether or not that is a solution to all of these problems, whether or not, that is a very present solution in something like encryption, maybe less so when we're talking about people wanting to build their own open source firearms. But there was a sort of more global and I think more complete solution to this problem offered by, Romaji, who said that it is maybe good to open source 85% of things, but that 100% of things might be too much. I think I can get down with this. I'm picking up what you're putting down, Romaji. Brun, yeah, I'm recording this the day before that video goes up, so I don't know exactly how it's gonna go, but just in case it does go this way, to anybody who is heading over to that video to have a calm, reasonable, and respectful conversation about this very interesting and very complex situation, thank you for being calm and reasonable and respectful. Ryan, the first and maybe the last Idea Channel episode that disproves Betterage's law. We should insert some crowd applause right here. Morgan, can we do that? Okay, we did it. We did, mission accomplished.